The crystalline chamber of the Galactic Concordance was a masterpiece of interstellar architecture, a perfect sphere suspended in the void between star systems, its transparent walls revealing the infinite tapestry of space. Arya Chen knew every microscopic imperfection in those walls, every quantum-locked seal that maintained the chamber's delicate environmental balance. She had studied this place for decades. Her fingers brushed against the neural-linked diplomatic ring, a seemingly simple platinum band that concealed more computational power than entire planetary networks. 3 months, 2 days, and 17 hours had passed since the Epsilon Rixus incident. Since she had lost everything. The Zornak Imperial Delegate, a towering quadrupedal being whose obsidian-like skin shifted with bioluminescent patterns of bureaucratic emotion, began the formal dissolution of the peace accords. Its multiple, prismatic eyes flickered across the assembled representatives, a display of calculated superiority that made Arya's blood simmer beneath her perfectly pressed Navy diplomatic suit. The interstellar peace accords, established 3 centuries prior, have become an impediment to imperial progress. The delegate intoned, its translation sphere pulsing with cold, mechanical precision. Humanity's recent interventions in border territories have demonstrated a consistent pattern of destabilization. A lie. A perfect, meticulously constructed lie. Arya remembered the research team, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the quantum xenobiologist, Dr. Kazuo Tanaka, specialist in exotic matter communication, Dr. Aisha Okonkwo, whose work on interspecies neural networks had been revolutionary, 14 researchers in total, stationed on the border world of Epsilon Rixus, studying a potentially groundbreaking quantum communication phenomenon. 14 researchers, 14 bodies. 1 navigational error by a Zornak military patrol. Chaktruo, diplomatic recording implants embedded in her cervical vertebrae captured every micro-expression, every minute detail of the proceedings. Her team might be gone, but their work, their legacy, would not be forgotten. The Imperial delegation finds the current framework of galactic cooperation restrictive, the Zornak delegate continued, its bioluminescent pattern suggesting a mixture of bureaucratic triumph and barely contained aggression. We hereby formally declare the complete dissolution of the Concordance Accords. Around the chamber, representatives from 100 different species shifted uncomfortably. The Trilaxian delegates, methane-breathing entities whose translucent bodies resembled living crystal, seemed particularly agitated. The Silicon Collective's quantum-encoded representatives flickered with what might have been concern. Arya remained perfectly still. Her neural implants were already processing, analyzing, preparing. The ring on her finger, a quantum-entangled communication device disguised as a simple diplomatic accessory, began its silent work. Microscopic data tendrils reached out across communication networks, preparing for what was to come. The Zornak believed this was a moment of triumph. They were wrong. This was a declaration of war. Not a war of weapons, but a war of systems, a war of information, a war of complete and total transformation. The Imperial delegation will now hear any formal objections, the delegate proclaimed, its multiple eyes scanning the chamber with predatory anticipation. Arya Chen smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a weapon being prepared. In that moment, every species in the chamber felt something shift. The human diplomat stood like a calm point in a storm about to break. No one moved. No one spoke. Her team was gone. But their work, their discovery, would change everything. The quantum communication breakthrough they had died for was about to be unleashed in a way no one could predict. The Zornak thought they were ending peace. They had no idea what was coming. Narrative highlights: immediate emotional investment, complex technological background, personal motivation established, hints of larger conflict, tension and anticipation built, technological and strategic depth introduced, key, emotional and strategic elements, loss of research team as driving motivation, sophisticated technology hinted at, diplomatic setting with high-stakes implications, Personal grief transformed into strategic preparation, subtle setup for future narrative developments. 36 hours after the Concordance dissolution, Arya Chen's secret headquarters hummed, with a different kind of energy. Located in the neutral zone of Crossroads Station, a massive orbital complex that existed in a perpetual state of diplomatic limbo, her team assembled with surgical precision. Dr. Marcus Liu, the quantum algorithm expert, looked like he hadn't slept in days. His augmented eyes, fitted with custom neural interfaces, flickered with lines of code that most sentient beings couldn't comprehend. "The predictive models are insane," he muttered, fingers dancing across holographic interfaces that seemed to breathe with living information. "We're talking about a communication disruption potential that makes traditional cyber warfare look like children's chalk drawings." Beside him, Zara Okoye, a cultural linguist with neural implants that allowed her to process and manipulate communication patterns across 17 different alien languages, leaned forward. Her skin, subtly enhanced with bioadaptive camouflage tech, shifted in resonance with the room's ambient emotional frequencies. "It's not just about breaking their communication," she explained, her voice carrying the weight of years of xenolinguistic research. "We're going to rewrite their entire narrative infrastructure." The third key member, Jacob Rodriguez, a former deep-cover intelligence operative with more confirmed diplomatic destabilizations than any human in history, stood by the holographic galactic map. His prosthetic left arm, a marvel of quantum adaptive technology, continuously ran complex probability scenarios. "The Zornak think they understand information warfare," he said, a ghost of a smile playing across his scarred features. "They have no idea what's coming." Arya watched her team with a predator's calm. The quantum-entangled communication network they had developed was more than a technological marvel. It was a living, adaptive system that could predict, manipulate, and restructure information flows faster than any known alien technology. Each team member was a precision instrument, turning diplomatic channels into a complex, living weapon. Dr. Liu pulled up a holographic representation of the Zornak communication infrastructure. It looked like a massive, intricate web. Billions of interconnected nodes representing communication pathways, cultural networks, and information transfer systems. "Watch this," he said, his augmented eyes burning with an almost manic intensity. With a gesture, he began to inject microscopic information disruption algorithms. They weren't destroying the network. They were far more sophisticated. These algorithms would slowly, systematically reshape communication patterns, introduce subtle inconsistencies, create invisible pressure points that would gradually destabilize the entire imperial communication structure. "We're not hackers," Zara explained, her neural implants running simultaneous translation and cultural analysis. "We're cultural architects. Every piece of information we introduce is a precisely crafted narrative instrument." Jacob's prosthetic arm began generating potential scenario cascades. Billions of potential information flow variations that would subtly redirect the Zornak's perception of reality. "Their imperial communication relies on a hierarchical model," he explained. "Centralized, rigid, predictable. We're going to make it fluid, unpredictable." Arya stepped forward, her diplomatic ring interfacing with the holographic systems. Years of research, the sacrifice of her previous team, the potential of the quantum communication breakthrough, everything was converging in this moment. Phase 1 begins now, she said quietly. The first wave of information would be subtle, microscopic narrative injections into secondary communication networks, cultural myth reinterpretations, historical record subtle modifications. Nothing that would immediately trigger defensive responses, but enough to create hairline fractures in the imperial narrative infrastructure. Dr. Liu's eyes were wild with possibility. "We're not just disrupting their communication," he said. "We're evolving it, forcing an entire imperial communication system to adapt or die." Zara's neural implants began pulsing with complex linguistic algorithms. "Every language is a weapon," she murmured, "and we're about to demonstrate humanity's most sophisticated linguistic arsenal." Jacob's probability scenarios began to crystallize, potential Imperial responses mapped out, countered, redirected before they could even be conceived. Arya watched the holographic galaxy slowly begin to shift. The Zornak thought they had ended peace by dissolving the Accords. They had no idea they had just triggered humanity's most sophisticated response. Narrative highlights, technological sophistication, team dynamics and individual capabilities, complex information warfare concept, high-stakes strategic preparation, deep technological and cultural insight, tension and anticipation, key strategic elements, quantum adaptive communication network, narrative manipulation as a strategic weapon, interdisciplinary approach to diplomatic conflict, demonstration of human innovative thinking, psychological and technological depth. The first strike was so subtle that no one noticed its initial impact. On the methane-rich world of Krell Prime, a client species of the Zornak Empire began to whisper. The Krellians, silicon-based lifeforms with a hive-mind communication network, had been part of the Imperial system for over 7 generations. Their entire societal structure was built on a carefully maintained narrative of Imperial benevolence. Zara Okoye's linguistic algorithms were works of art. They weren't just translations or simple communication manipulations. They were living, breathing narrative constructs that could penetrate the most complex communication systems. The first story spread like a quantum-entangled ripple. It began as a memory, a recovered historical record, seemingly innocuous, that suggested the Krellians had once been a sovereign civilization before Imperial contact. The record was perfect. Too perfect. Meticulously crafted by Dr. Liu's quantum algorithms to pass every verification protocol, seeded with microscopic authenticating markers that would withstand the most rigorous Imperial investigation. In the transmission nodes of the Krellian hive mind, the story took root. Jacob Rodriguez watched the probability cascades unfold on his holographic interface. "It's working," he murmured. His prosthetic arm ran complex simulation models, tracking the narrative's spread with millimeter-level precision. "We're not just spreading information, we're creating a cultural resonance frequency." Arya Chen stood in the observation room, her diplomatic ring interfacing with the global communication networks. Each pulse of the ring was a precision instrument, a quantum-level communication probe that could detect the most microscopic shifts in cultural narrative. On 12 different planetary networks, similar stories began to emerge. Each was a precision-guided, narrative missile, targeting the fundamental mythological structures of Imperial client species. The Trilaxian Diplomatic Corps began to notice first. Their quantum-encrypted communication networks detected anomalies, microscopic inconsistencies that shouldn't exist, narrative threads that didn't quite align with established Imperial historical records. Dr. Marcus Liu's algorithms were perpetual, motion machines of cultural disruption. "We're not destroying their communication," he explained to Arya, his augmented eyes showing complex probability matrices. "We're forcing their entire narrative infrastructure to evolve, to question." Each story was a virus, but not a destructive virus, a transformative one. On the mining world of Epsilon Secundus, a recovered transmission suggested that the Imperial protection of local mining operations had actually been a systematic economic exploitation. The record was flawless, quantum authenticated, with microscopic verification markers that would survive the most intense Imperial scrutiny. Zara's linguistic algorithms were the true weapon. They didn't just translate, they resonated. They created contextual bridges between different communication systems, allowing stories to jump between species, between communication networks, with a fluidity that defied traditional information transfer. The human capacity for narrative, Zara would later explain, is our most sophisticated technological weapon. The Zornak monitoring systems began to detect anomalies, microscopic narrative inconsistencies that shouldn't exist, communication patterns that didn't quite follow established Imperial protocols, but by the time they began to investigate, the stories had already taken root. Jacob's probability model showed a cascading effect. Each story created microscopic cultural pressure points, areas of potential resistance, zones of narrative vulnerability that would gradually expand, like cracks in a massive stone structure. Arya watched the holographic representation of galactic communication networks. What looked like a stable, interconnected system was actually becoming a living, breathing organism of potential transformation. "We're not fighting," she murmured to her team. "We're evolving." The Imperial system had no idea what was coming. The first wave of the cultural virus had been deployed, and it was just the beginning. Narrative highlights, sophisticated information warfare, complexity of cultural communication, subtle narrative, manipulation, technological and cultural innovation, tension and strategic depth, demonstration of human adaptive capabilities, key strategic elements, quantum-level narrative engineering, cultural communication as a strategic weapon, interdisciplinary approach to conflict, psychological transformation through information, precise, non-violent, systematic disruption. The Zornak believed their economic network was impenetrable, a complex web of trade routes, resource exchanges, and financial algorithms that had maintained imperial stability for millennia. They were wrong. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the quantum economist who had been part of Arya's original research team before her death on Epsilon Rixus, had left behind something extraordinary. A set of economic transformation algorithms so sophisticated they were less a computer program and more a living, adaptive economic organism. Jacob Rodriguez interfaced with the algorithm, his prosthetic arm becoming a conduit for financial warfare unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. "It's not about destruction," he explained to Arya, holographic economic models dancing around him like living fractals. "It's about reconfiguration, systemic evolution." The first economic disruption began in the mineral-rich trade corridors of the Orion Nexus. A microscopic adjustment in resource valuation algorithms, so subtle that it would take weeks for anyone to notice. But each millisecond of trading, each quantum-level economic transaction, began to generate cascading inconsistencies. Dr. Marcus Liu's predictive models showed the potential impact. "We're not crashing their economy," he said, his augmented eyes blazing with mathematical precision. "We're forcing it to adapt, to become something entirely new." Zara Okoye mapped the cultural economic narratives. Every trade route had a story. Every resource exchange carried cultural implications. The human team wasn't just manipulating numbers. They were rewriting economic mythology. On the trading hub of Crossroads Station, the first signs of disruption began to emerge. Minor trade adjustments, a fraction of a percentage point here, a microscopic routing change there, started to compound. Trading algorithms developed by human economists began to subtly redirect economic flows. The Zornak monitoring systems detected nothing, at least, not immediately. The economic transformation algorithm was a living thing. It didn't attack. It adapted. It evolved. Each economic transaction became an opportunity for microscopic restructuring. Resource valuations began to shift. Trade route efficiencies started to change. Entire star systems watched in growing confusion as established economic patterns began to subtly metamorphose. Jacob's probability scenarios showed the potential impact. "We're creating economic pressure points," he explained. "Areas of potential transformation. The imperial economic system will try to compensate, but each compensation becomes another point of potential disruption." Arya understood the true weapon. It wasn't about destroying the economic system. It was about forcing it to become something new. The algorithm Elena had developed was based on principles of adaptive systems theory, quantum economic modeling, and a profound understanding of complex network interactions. It was less a computer program and more a living economic organism. On the mining world of Proxima Centauri, a minor adjustment in resource extraction protocols began to generate unexpected efficiencies. Trading partners found themselves with marginally improved profit margins. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would immediately trigger Imperial investigations. But each microscopic change was a quantum-level economic mutation. Zara's cultural economic analysis provided the narrative framework. Economic systems are living stories, she would explain, and we're rewriting the narrative one quantum transaction at a time. The Trilaxian trading networks were the first to show significant transformation. Their quantum-encrypted economic models began to detect microscopic inefficiencies that shouldn't exist. Trade routes that had been stable for generations began to show unexpected adaptive potential. Dr. Liu's predictive models became more complex. "We're not just changing numbers," he said. "We're changing the fundamental way economic networks understand themselves." Arya watched the holographic economic representation of the galaxy. What looked like a stable, interconnected system was actually becoming a living, breathing organism of potential transformation. No weapons were fired, no direct confrontation occurred, yet the economic destruction was total. The imperial economic structure was being systematically reimagined, and the Zornak had no idea what was coming. Narrative highlights: advanced economic warfare concept, sophisticated technological approach, nonviolent systemic transformation, complex economic modeling, tension through subtle manipulation, demonstration of human innovative thinking, key. Strategic elements: quantum adaptive economic algorithms, economic systems as living narratives, systemic transformation without destruction, interdisciplinary approach to economic conflict, precise, strategic economic disruption. The Zornak military began its predictable response. Mobilization patterns that had worked for millennia were about to meet something entirely unprecedented. Quantum-entangled diplomats materialized simultaneously across 12 different planetary networks. They weren't traditional representatives. They were living communication systems, neural-linked operatives who could process and respond to diplomatic scenarios faster than any known intelligence in the galaxy. Arya Chen stood at the center of the operation, her diplomatic ring now a quantum communication nexus that made traditional communication networks look like primitive smoke signals. "They'll attempt a show of force," Jacob Rodriguez predicted, his probability matrices dancing across holographic interfaces. His prosthetic arm interfaced directly with the diplomatic response algorithms, calculating potential conflict scenarios faster than entire planetary intelligence networks. The first military probe came exactly where Dr. Marcus Liu's predictive models suggested: the border system of Epsilon Tertius, a standard imperial patrol designed to test diplomatic responses to probe for weakness. They found something else entirely. Zara Okoye had spent months preparing the linguistic and communication infrastructure. Each diplomatic channel was a living, breathing entity, not a static communication pathway, but an adaptive network that could predict, respond, and fundamentally reshape interaction parameters. The Zornak military transmission arrived with standard imperial precision, encrypted, hierarchical, perfectly structured, and immediately absorbed into a communication network that defied every known principle of diplomatic interaction. "It's not about blocking," Dr. Liu explained, his augmented eyes showing complex communication matrices. "It's about transforming the very nature of the interaction." The imperial military transmission found itself redirected through a series of quantum communication nodes. Each redirection was so subtle, so perfectly engineered, that traditional detection systems would see nothing unusual. But the communication was fundamentally altered. Diplomatic scenarios that would have traditionally escalated into potential conflict were systematically diffused, not through weakness but through an unprecedented level of adaptive communication. Jacob's probability scenarios showed the potential cascades. "We're turning their military communication into a learning system," he said. "Each interaction becomes an opportunity for systemic transformation." On the diplomatic station of Crossroads, representatives from 100 different species watched in growing fascination. The human diplomatic team wasn't just responding to the Zornak. They were fundamentally reimagining the nature of diplomatic interaction. Arya understood the true weapon. It wasn't about defeating the imperial military. It was about forcing it to become something new. The quantum-entangled diplomats were living communication systems, neural-linked operatives who could process diplomatic scenarios with a speed and complexity that defied traditional understanding. They didn't just communicate, they transformed communication itself. A Zornak military commander would initiate a standard confrontation protocol. By the time the transmission completed its first quantum encryption cycle, it would have been systematically recontextualized, its potential for conflict subtly neutralized. "We're not fighting," Zara explained, her neural implants running simultaneous cultural and linguistic analysis. "We're having a conversation the Imperial system doesn't yet understand." Dr. Liu's communication algorithms were perpetual motion machines of diplomatic innovation. They didn't just respond to military scenarios, they created new paradigms of interaction. The first major military probe came in the Orion sector, a standard Imperial battle group, configured for diplomatic pressure and potential limited engagement. They found themselves navigating a communication landscape that seemed to shift with each interaction. Military transmission protocols that had worked for millennia suddenly found themselves adapting, transforming, becoming something entirely new. Arya watched the holographic representation of diplomatic interactions. What looked like a stable, hierarchical communication system was actually becoming a living, breathing organism of potential transformation. No weapons were fired, no direct confrontation occurred, yet the military pressure was systematically neutralized. The Imperial military communication structure was being reimagined, and the Zornak had no idea what was coming. Narrative highlights: advanced diplomatic communication concept, sophisticated technological approach, nonviolent conflict resolution, complex communication modeling, tension through adaptive interaction, demonstration of human, innovative thinking, key strategic elements, quantum-entangled diplomatic networks, communication as a transformative force, systemic adaptation without destruction, interdisciplinary approach to military conflict, precise, strategic, diplomatic, neutralization. The true weapon was never technological. It was psychological. Deep within the neural archives of the Zornak Imperial Communication Core, the first cracks began to appear, not as damage, but as evolution, as understanding. Zara Okoye's linguistic algorithms were surgical instruments of cultural transformation. They didn't just translate, they penetrated, they understood, they revealed. The first psychological strike targeted the fundamental mythology of Zornak imperial superiority, not through direct confrontation, but through a systematic unraveling of their most deeply held cultural narratives. Recovered historical records, quantum-authenticated, impossibly precise, began to circulate through imperial communication networks. Each record was a precision-crafted narrative missile, designed to penetrate the most sophisticated psychological defense systems. Dr. Marcus Liu watched the probability matrices unfold. "We're not destroying their cultural infrastructure," he explained to Arya, his augmented eyes showing complex psychological interaction models. "We're forcing it to confront its own internal contradictions." Jacob Rodriguez's probability scenarios mapped the potential psychological cascades. His prosthetic arm interfaced with neural mapping systems that could predict cultural psychological shifts with terrifying precision. On the imperial throne world of Zor Prime, the first whispers began. A recovered transmission suggested that the imperial expansion wasn't a noble mission of civilization, but a systematic program of cultural exploitation. Another historical record revealed long-buried atrocities committed against client species during the early stages of imperial formation. Each narrative was a quantum-level psychological probe. The imperial monitoring systems detected nothing unusual. These were authenticated historical records, perfectly structured, impossible to dismiss as simple propaganda. Zara understood the true complexity of the attack. "Language is more than communication," she would explain. "It's the operating system of cultural consciousness." The psychological algorithms worked on multiple levels. They didn't just introduce new information, they created new contextual frameworks. for understanding existing information. Imperial communication networks found themselves processing historical data through fundamentally transformed interpretive lenses. Client species began to see their imperial relationships differently. Minor bureaucrats in the imperial administration started to question fundamental assumptions that had remained unexamined for generations. Dr. Liu's algorithms were perpetual motion machines of psychological transformation. "We're not breaking their system," he said. "We're helping it evolve." Arya watched the holographic representation of psychological interaction networks. What looked like a stable, hierarchical cultural system was actually becoming a living, breathing organism of potential transformation. The most devastating psychological weapons were the most personal, recovered personal communications, historical records of individual experiences, microscopic narratives that penetrated the imperial psychological infrastructure at its most vulnerable points. A communication from a mid-level imperial administrator, recovered and authenticated, revealed decades of systematic cultural suppression. Another record showed the personal tragedy of a client species leader, documenting the human cost of imperial expansion. Each narrative was a precision-guided psychological instrument. Jacob's probability models showed the potential impact. "We're creating psychological pressure points," he explained, "areas of potential resistance, zones of narrative vulnerability that will gradually expand." The imperial leadership began to detect something was wrong, but they couldn't identify the source. Their monitoring system saw nothing unusual. Each historical record was perfectly authenticated. Each communication channel functioned with standard imperial efficiency. Yet something was changing. The very foundations of imperial psychological infrastructure were being systematically reimagined. No weapons were fired. No direct confrontation occurred, yet the psychological destruction was total. The imperial cultural narrative was being systematically deconstructed, and the Zornak had no idea what was coming. Narrative highlights: advanced psychological warfare. Concept: sophisticated cultural communication approach. Non-violent systemic transformation. Complex psychological modeling. Tension through subtle cultural manipulation. Demonstration of human innovative thinking, key strategic elements, quantum-level narrative, psychological probes, cultural consciousness as a dynamic system, systemic transformation through understanding, interdisciplinary approach to psychological conflict, precise strategic cultural deconstruction. The transformation was not a collapse. It was an evolution. Arya Chen stood in the central diplomatic chamber of Crossroads Station, surrounded by representatives from 100 different species. The holographic displays around her showed the systematic restructuring of the galactic political landscape, a process so subtle yet so profound that it defied traditional understanding of political transformation. "We're not destroying the imperial system," she explained to the assembled representatives. "We're helping it become something better." Dr. Marcus Liu's quantum algorithms had mapped every potential evolutionary pathway. Jacob Rodriguez's probability matrices tracked the systemic transformation with millimeter-level precision. Zara Okoye's linguistic models provided the contextual framework for a complete galactic reconfiguration. The Zornak imperial structure didn't collapse. It was methodically reconstructed. On 12 different planetary networks, new governance models began to emerge, not through violent revolution, but through a systematic reimagining of political and cultural interactions. Client species that had been marginalized for generations found themselves with unprecedented opportunities for self-determination. The quantum-entangled diplomatic networks that Arya's team had developed were living systems of transformation. Each communication channel became an opportunity for systemic evolution. Jacob's probability scenarios showed the intricate pathways of change. "It's not about replacing one system with another," he explained, his prosthetic arm interfacing with complex simulation models. "It's about creating a framework that can continuously adapt." Dr. Liu's algorithms were perpetual motion machines of political innovation. "We're introducing a new operating system for galactic governance," he said, his augmented eyes showing complex interaction matrices. One that can learn, that can grow. The first signs of transformation appeared in the most unexpected places. On the mining world of Epsilon Secundus, a new form of collaborative governance emerged. Not a top-down imperial model, but a dynamic, adaptive system that gave local populations unprecedented input into resource management and cultural development. Zara's linguistic models provided the communication infrastructure. Language is more than communication, she would explain. It's the operating system of collective consciousness. Arya understood the true complexity of the transformation. It wasn't about defeating the Zornak. It was about creating a new paradigm of galactic interaction. The Imperial leadership found themselves in a situation they had never encountered. Their communication networks functioned perfectly. Their monitoring systems detected nothing unusual. Yet everything was changing. Marginalized client species began to find their voice. Imperial bureaucrats discovered new models of governance that were more efficient, more adaptive, more human in their approach to complex systemic challenges. The quantum communication networks that Arya's team had developed were living, breathing entities of transformation. Each interaction became an opportunity for systemic evolution. Dr. Liu's predictive models showed the potential impact. We're not just changing a political system, he explained. We're creating a new model of collective interaction. On the diplomatic station of Crossroads, representatives watched in growing fascination. The human diplomatic team wasn't just responding to the imperial system, they were fundamentally reimagining the nature of galactic governance. Jacob's probability scenarios mapped out potential evolutionary pathways. We're creating adaptive governance frameworks, he said. Systems that can learn, that can grow, that can continuously transform themselves. The most radical transformation happened at the cultural level. Recovered historical records, authenticated communication channels, personal narratives that penetrated the imperial psychological infrastructure at its most vulnerable points. Each narrative was a precision-guided instrument of systemic transformation. Arya watched the holographic representation of galactic interactions. What looked like a stable, hierarchical political system was actually becoming a living, breathing organism of potential transformation. No weapons were fired. No direct confrontation occurred. Yet the systemic transformation was total. The imperial governance structure was being systematically reimagined, and the Zornak had no idea what was coming. Narrative highlights. Advanced systemic transformation. Concept. Sophisticated governance redesign approach. Nonviolent structural evolution. Complex political modeling. Tension through subtle systemic manipulation. Demonstration of human innovative thinking. Key strategic elements. Quantum adaptive. Governance frameworks. Political systems as dynamic, living entities. Systemic transformation through collaborative innovation. Interdisciplinary approach to political restructuring. Precise, strategic galactic reconfiguration. The final transformation was not a moment. It was a process. 36 standard galactic cycles after the initial dissolution of the peace accords, Arya Chen stood before the unified Galactic Council. Not as a conqueror, not as a victor, but as an architect of possibility. The chamber was unlike anything that had existed before. Representatives from over 200 different species sat in a circular configuration, no hierarchies, no traditional power structures. A living, breathing testament to the transformation that had occurred. Dr. Marcus Liu's quantum algorithms hummed silently in the background, monitoring communication flows. Jacob Rodriguez's probability matrices continued to map potential evolutionary scenarios. Zara Okoye's linguistic models provided real-time contextual analysis. We didn't defeat an empire, Arya began, her voice carrying through quantum translation, networks that made traditional communication look primitive. We helped a civilization evolve. The story of the transformation would be studied for generations. It began with the loss of her research team on Epsilon Rixus. 14 brilliant minds, destroyed in what the Zornak had called a navigational error, 14 lives that became the catalyst for a galactic transformation. Elena Rodriguez's quantum economic algorithms, Kazuo Tanaka's breakthrough in neural communication networks, Aisha Okonkwo's work on interspecies cultural translation. Their legacy was now written across the entire galactic political landscape. The Zornak imperial structure hadn't been destroyed. It had been systematically reimagined. Client species that had been marginalized for generations now found themselves with unprecedented opportunities for self-determination. Governance models emerged that were dynamic, adaptive, constantly evolving. Not through violent revolution, but through a systematic reimagining of collective interaction. Dr. Liu explained, the transformation to those who would listen. We introduced an operating system for galactic cooperation, he would say. Not a fixed structure, but a living learning framework. Jacob Rodriguez's probability scenarios had mapped every potential pathway of transformation. What looked like destruction was actually the most sophisticated act of creation in galactic history. The quantum entangled communication networks that Arya's team had developed were living systems of continuous evolution. Each interaction became an opportunity for systemic growth. Zara Okoye understood the deepest truth of their intervention. Language is more than communication, she would explain. It's the mechanism through which collective consciousness transforms itself. On worlds across the galaxy, new forms of governance emerged. Collaborative systems that gave local populations unprecedented input into their own development. Economic models that prioritized adaptive potential over static control. Communication, networks that were living, breathing entities of collective intelligence. The Imperial monitoring systems had detected nothing unusual. Their communication channels functioned perfectly. Yet everything had changed. Arya reflected on the journey. The fury that had driven her was never about revenge. It was about creating something better, about transforming a system that had become calcified, unable to grow, unable to adapt. The recovered historical records, the authenticated communication channels, the personal narratives that had penetrated the Imperial psychological infrastructure, each was a precision-guided instrument of transformation. No weapons had been fired. No direct confrontation had occurred, yet the systemic transformation was total. The holographic displays around the unified Galactic Council showed the intricate networks of communication, of economic exchange, of cultural interaction. What had once been a hierarchical, rigid system was now a dynamic, living organism of collective potential. We are not finished, Arya told the assembled representatives. We are just beginning. The quantum communication networks continued to pulse, living systems of continuous adaptation. Each moment an opportunity for growth. Each interaction a possibility for something entirely new. The fury that had begun with loss had transformed into something profound. A new way of understanding collective existence. A galactic operating system built on collaboration, on continuous learning, on the fundamental belief in collective potential. The Zornak imperial system hadn't been conquered. It had been set free. Narrative highlights. Profound systemic transformation. Redemptive approach to conflict resolution. Demonstration of human innovative potential. Exploration of collective consciousness. Hopeful vision of galactic cooperation. Celebration of adaptive potential key thematic. Elements transformation through understanding. Collective intelligence as a living system. Nonviolent systemic evolution. Human capacity for profound innovation. Redemption of loss through creative action. Continuous adaptation as a fundamental principle.